Wang 1 beneath Beigu Mountain. The road we travel passes by this blue mountain. Boats float by on the green water before us. At high tide, the shores are far apart. The wind freshens and a sail is spread. The sun rises over the sea in the end of night. Spring on the river is like last year. Letters home. How can I send them? Only with the geese returning to Luoyang. So here we have a little poem by Wang. He is not a very famous person. In fact, I had never heard of him. Not that I am an expert in Chinese poetry, but he's not one of the famous Tang writers. In fact, this edition contains a minor biographical section at the end, but it doesn't give much details about him anyway. He only has this poem in the anthology. He was from Luoyang, which is referred in the last line of the poem, and he got his Jinshi decree in 712. So we should consider him a high Tang poet. He probably wrote most of his poetry and lived most of his life in the first half of the 8th century. There are no further news of him after the year 730. And so not much information about him. The poem is about Beigu Mountain. I have made a little bit of a research, and Beigu Mountain is located in the city of Chengjiang. And the city of Chengjiang was located in the province of Jiangsu, which is in the eastern coast of China, just below Shandong. So that's the region, or one of the regions, through which the Jiangsu River passes in its way to the sea. Now, and so part of the Grand Canal, I imagine. So more things, and the topic of the poem is traveling. It is a very, very stereotypical poem. We could say there are two topics actually. One of them is homesickness, the traveler away from home, the melancholy and sadness of the traveler who is far from his homeland. But there is a second element, which is also landscape description. So the area surrounding Beigu Mountain, with its big rivers and the sea nearby, is succinctly but effectively described in the central couplets of the poem. So both elements would be the main topics of the poem. On the one hand, the generic and conventional topic of the traveler and the sadness of the traveler, and on the other hand, description of the place the traveler is passing through, which is also a rather conventional topic. So let's, as usual, take a look at the couplets. This is, as we know, a lushi, so it has 8 lines, 2 couplets, and in theory, the 2 central couplets should be rigidly parallelistic. The road we travel passes by this blue mountain. Boats float by on the green water before us. So the first couplet starts to put some flesh into the title. The title is Under Beigu Mountain. So the traveler, the poet, is part of a group of travelers who is passing by the mountain. Very interesting. The imagery includes the mountain and the water. So the combination of the two clearly shows us that we're in a region in which mountains aren't far from water. We're in the eastern sea coast, or in a river coastal area that is also mountainous. So we have on the one hand the mountain, but on the other hand the boats floating on the green water. So mountain and sea combined into one site and into a picturesque landscape. More information about this picturesque landscape is developed in the next 2 couplets. At high tide, the shores are far apart. The wind freshens and a sail is spread. So it seems the poet and his group wants to cross the river to get to the other side. This is high tide, so when it's low tide, the distance between the shores is slightly smaller, but now it's perceived as much, much bigger. So a boat has to be employed to cross. Probably a boat would have to be employed even in low tide, but anyway. So there's a fresh wind, and a sail is spread for crossing from one side to the other. The poem's next two couplets imply a certain jump in time forwards. The sun rises over the sea in the end of night. Spring on the river is like last year. So we are supposed to imagine, I guess, that's my interpretation, that the poet and his group mounted on the boat and went downstream towards the sea, probably not intending to enter the sea though, probably just crossing the big wide river to the other shore, but having a glimpse of the sea. The boat crossing took them at least all night, or most of the night. In the morning they could see the sun rising from the waters, and poetic reflection. Spring has come. We have beautiful spring sights in this spring morning next to the river, and this spring is like last year's spring. We've talked in previous poems about how a contrast between the cyclical and perennial renewal of nature is very often contrasted in poems about travelers, with the fact that humans do not renew themselves like spring. Spring after spring, nature is still verdant and green and flowery, but men, on the contrary, become older and weaker and sadder. So there's this antithesis. The spring on the river is like last year, subliminally seems to imply, but we are not in last year, we're in this year. I'm 1 year older, and I've been traveling and suffering the discomforts and the psychological suffering of traveling, of being away from home. That this seems to be the case, seems to be pointed in the last couplet, which again brings us back to the topics of the sadness of the traveler that hadn't been explicitly mentioned until now. Letters home, how can I send them? Only with the geese returning to Luoyang. Feeling homesick, feeling that yet another year has passed in traveling, and another year has passed while being far from his home and family and friends. One thinks about writing a letter back home, but who is going to send the letter? Remember, this is a pre-modern society. Medieval China didn't have anything quite as a modern postal service. So when you wanted to send letters, you generally required friends or people you met who were going in the right direction to do you the favor of taking the letter with you. So there was no regular postal service except for the emperor and his carriages. So who is going to take my letters home? How could I communicate back with my relatives and friends back home? Probably I'm not able to do it. He says, only with the geese returning to Luoyang. So birds are migrating back. We are in the east coast of China, not in the south. This is the center of China. And it seems to be in spring. So I imagine the cycle of the geese, as was indicated perhaps by some of the poems we've just read. For example, I think, which was it? Was it Song Jiwen's, which talked also about geese? Yeah. So the cycle of the geese might be that in autumn, they live in the north of China. In autumn, they fly to the south of China, and probably they get back north in spring. So now it's spring. It's much north. It's much to the north of the Beigu Mountains. We're in Beigu Mountain in the east. So probably geese can be seen flying back to that area and to other northern areas. And the poet imagines, as in the hallowed old tradition of Chinese legend and myth of sending messages through geese, that only the flying geese would be able to take his message back to Luoyang. So on the whole, pretty conventional poem. It's not bad, but there's nothing in it that particularly stands out, neither in the landscape description or in the images. So pretty conventional piece. I imagine pretty useful in an anthology like this. That was, if you remember from what we've said earlier, this anthology was made for children. It was the first exposition that during the Qing dynasty most children got of the literary canon of the Tang. They were supposed to read and memorize these poems and to use them perhaps as models for composition of their own before they got to the serious study of the whole of Tang poetry, which is more than 10 times the number of poems in this anthology. I think at least 30,000 poems have been preserved from the Tang Dynasty, perhaps even more. So, this poem would show you how to write a conventional poem on the topic of being sad from home in spring and longing for return. So, not a bad piece, but, pretty conventional.